Great. So welcome. I'm Aaron Chuey. I'm a grad student at Stanford in the Social Learning Lab. I'll be kicking off our little segment of online methods today, and specifically talking about how we can think about a comparison between online and in-person methods. But before I get started, I just want to ask how many people in the room have actually either run an online study or been involved in an online study? Okay, almost everyone. That's great. If no one raised their hand, it would have been a little weird that I'm giving this kind of presentation, but I think people have a variety of feelings about sort of going online. On the one hand, it's been stressful. We've all kind of had to scramble to move online. But on the other hand, it's also, I think, been pretty nice. We've really collaborated, and I think, this hasn't been as formalized as some of this big team science, but in some ways it is like a field-wide collaboration, kind of working together to get this stuff working, and I think it has resulted in some interesting methodological innovations, which I'll talk about a little bit, but other speakers will touch more on. So, even before COVID, there was a number of ways that folks had tried to run children in online studies. A variety of platforms like Lookit and the Child Lab and Panda, which were mainly limited to a specific either research team or a few research teams. But since COVID, obviously, this has forced many of us to move our research online. This has resulted in some wider scale collaboration. In some cases, this was kind of a flash in the pan type of thing, like our lab gave a webinar along with folks from the Child Lab in June 2020, as well as more formalized large-scale initiatives like Children Helping Science to help with overall recruitment in the field. And I think more recently, this has culminated in a Frontiers special issue about empirical research in developmental science and new methods. Most of these articles, it's almost 40 articles, have dealt with online methods. Specifically, it's a great resource. Check it out if you haven't. But our Frontiers paper is what we're mainly drawing from for this presentation today, and I'll be referencing it throughout. But perhaps also, I've kind of talked up online studies. Maybe you don't have such a rosy picture. Maybe you're ready to go back to in-person. Maybe you're skeptical of online methods. And so today, I really want to sort of talk about two main things. One is, how do online methods actually compare to in-person methods? Are they that different, or are they actually similar fundamentally? And secondly, how do the results of online and in-person studies compare to one another? I think this is a big question many of us might worry about. Maybe you're reviewing a paper and you want to know, how skeptical should I be that this paper was conducted online? Is it actually comparable to an in-person result? And so today I'm going to hopefully get at that a little bit. But to start off, I want to just talk a little bit about how data is actually acquired online, just so we're all on the same page. And there's two main methods that folks have used. One is what I'll call moderated methods, which are synchronous sessions. They're a lot like in person. There's an experimenter who directs a study, and it's just online. It's just through video chat. In many ways, this is like an in-person study, but conducted online. There's also unmoderated methods, so this is like Lookit or Panda, that are more automated, and these are where participants are completing a module at their own pace without an experimenter being present. This is a little more far afield from in-person, so you might be especially wondering, how does this compare to in-person results and methods? Other folks are going to talk about methods today, so I'm going to go through it fairly quickly, just so we're all on the same page here. One of the major ways that folks have actually run online studies is just through collecting verbal responses. And overall, these sorts of designs are pretty similar to in-person, just with a few additional constraints. You might be a little bit intimidated just staring at a screen and thinking, is a kid engaged? Like, is this, this feels very different than an in-person interaction. But I think myself and many others feel that when designed well, online studies can be pretty satisfying, and I think children can really enjoy them and get great data. But again, this does require some additional methodological innovations here. So, for example, pointing is something we can't really record easily online. This is quite difficult. You might see on a screen children trying to point, but this is not something that's very easy for us to actually tell what they're pointing at. So instead, we often replace pointing with instead children responding using some clear visual cues, which I'll get to in a second. And also, children's environments online can be sort of harder to curate, right? In a lab or even in a museum, we can sort of set up the local environment in the way that's nice and controlled. All participants have the same experience. At home, you don't know necessarily what it's going to be like. A cat could, crawl across their keyboard. You don't really know, right? I think I've had that experience. I think many others have as well. So setup is also very important. So for example, online, you might start off by just making sure that participants or that your video isn't blocking the screen, and that you want to show a video, your video doesn't just show up right in the center of their screen. This just requires a little bit of setup to make a real difference in avoiding technical troubles. You might play a video at the beginning to make sure that they can actually hear your audio. Of course, there's also technical problems in person, but these are a little bit easier to address and to assess. And I also think that there's some interesting ways that setup can be used methodologically. For example, gaze cues are something that we use all the time in person. Online, they're a little harder, but based on how you position your video, you can actually simulate gaze. And this is especially nice for younger children. But in terms of how the studies are actually run, you've had this setup. The studies themselves can be pretty similar. So I might show a video like this one. I play a video today, but kids might see a video, and then they might just be asked a simple DD question, like which one knows how the toy works, blue or orange? And notice these are color coded, so they're easy to refer to. Instead of in person, you might just have kids point. Overall, these are pretty small modifications. Like fundamentally, the studies feel pretty similar, but these small modifications can make a really big difference. And overall, both for the quality of our data, but also participant experience, whether children are actually enjoying the study or not. And I find myself often thinking, starting there, and then good data tends to follow. But those were verbal response studies. You might be wondering about looking studies, which is especially important for younger children. Looking is readily available online. As long as participants have a camera, you can see and infants are positioned, you can measure their looking. But of course, this can be actually tricky to do so in practice. It requires even more setup, making sure infants are well positioned. So this is certainly not easy. Other things you can't measure as easily online. So for example, reaching studies, you might, for example, show infants a test event and then present them with two objects and see which one they reach for. That's obviously difficult to do online. But instead, this can actually be replaced with preferential looking as well. So infants might view a test event, and then at the end, they might view a test video where there's two objects sort of moving on either side of the screen, like I have here, and you can measure where infants look. And Brandon Wu and Liz Felke have actually implemented this online and have managed to replicate a preferential reaching study with a preferential looking study. So this is certainly feasible. Violation of expectation studies as well have also been implemented online. So as difficult as it might be to imagine actually running some of these, there's sort of a number of studies that have actually accomplished this. And so I think overall this suggests that these methods are viable online, even if somewhat difficult. And I think they take some effort to get right, especially in terms of producing easily codable data, but it's certainly doable. So obviously one major limit of online here is that your measures are constrained by participants' hardware in a way that's not constrained by in person. You can bring an eye tracker in the lab, but you can't necessarily give participants an eye tracker. Obviously, folks are developing some pretty interesting software to simulate this online, but nonetheless, we're still limited fundamentally by participants' hardware online. But I also think this gives us an opportunity to innovate some pretty interesting methods. And I think as we as a field continue to run more online studies, we'll develop some newer methods. So I've only talked about really verbal measures and looking measures today, but you can imagine some interesting ones like having participants draw a picture and show it on screen, right? This could be an interesting way to measure a fundamentally rich behavior that is doable online. And, folks may have not necessarily thought about doing a particular study in this way unless they ran it online. So I think this is pretty interesting. But of course, we're still left with the fundamental question, which is, I painted a pretty rosy picture of online studies. They're not too different. Takes a little bit of work to get them right, but how do the results actually compare to in-person results? I think that's a big question as a field we've been wondering, and today I'll hopefully be able to give a little bit of an answer about that. So in our own Frontiers paper, we did do a small-scale meta-analysis. So we have 4 studies. I just want to thank my collaborators here who contributed data to this. I won't go over this too much, but this is just a forest plot showing effect sizes of 4 pairs of study conducted online and in person, 4 replications, and we found that they were pretty comparable. And there's been a number of individual replications that have found similar results, pretty comparable between online and in person. But of course, these are all pretty limited. These are all, this is only 4 pairs of studies, tiny, tiny n. Also, they're all pretty much like social cognition studies. So you might actually wonder, field-wide, like how do online studies look? I also mentioned these are all moderated studies too. So this says nothing about unmoderated data. So to get at that, my collaborators and I are conducting a meta-analysis for all the online and in-person replications that have been conducted so far, and I'll be describing that now. So we had a few pre-registered inclusion criteria here. One is we wanted to make sure that we captured online studies that actually replicate in-person studies. So now online studies are just being run, and that's the starting point. There are many studies now that they have an online component and no in-person pair. So we wanted to make sure we actually got real replications. This could either be a lab that conducted a study both in person and online, or a lab that conducted an online study that directly replicates an in-person result. Obviously, the data collection has to be complete. We don't want any partial data sets here. And also, we wanted to focus on younger children. Older children might be more robust and might be a little more adult-like. So we constrained our data here to any studies where the mean age is younger than 6 years. And our literature search yielded 15 papers, 31 study pairs, and 104 effect sizes. So not massive, but certainly greater than this 4 study pair that I presented from the Frontiers paper. Obviously, our main moderator that we're looking at here is study location, whether it was conducted online or in person, but there might be some others you're interested in. For example, you might be interested in the online study method, whether it was moderated or unmoderated. Moderated, pretty similar to in-person, unmoderated, maybe a little farther afield, so you might wonder whether unmoderated studies also replicate the different kinds of dependent measures. So we don't have enough studies to get too nitty-gritty with this, but just looking at looking versus non-looking studies, and whether there's a difference between those kinds of measures. And then also age, since we have a pretty wide age range to look at here. So the results that I'm going to present, I'm just going to acclimate you to the graph first. So you'll see that the papers are rows here. And what I'm actually plotting is the standard mean difference. So this is going to be the difference in effect sizes between the online study and the in-person study. It turns out that a forest plot with 104 effect sizes is pretty gnarly. So that's why I'm plotting it this way. Each paper may have multiple individual studies. So you might see multiple dots. So for example, this first paper here, you'll notice it has a big negative number. So this is online versus in-person effect size. So a big negative number means there's a much stronger effect in person than online. A 0 would mean that they're the same. A positive number means online was stronger. And here is the full, here's our full sample here. So actually, we didn't find much of a difference between online and in-person. There's slight. In-person is a little bit stronger. We had a standardized effect size of about 0.64 in person versus 0.45 online, but this is not a significant difference. So overall, there seems to be, online seems comparable, but you'll notice that there's a lot of variance. Some studies, really took a hit online. Others actually seem to be doing even better online. So you might wonder, what studies are those, and what are they doing differently? So here's the first moderator here. So here's moderated studies versus unmoderated studies. And we actually don't find a significant effect here, but we have a pretty low sample. And you may also wonder about the effect of outliers, especially given our low sample size here. So you'll notice that moderated studies may appear to actually fare a little bit better. So perhaps but again, this is a pretty small sample size and it is not significant in our model. And then here's age, and across ages in general, it also seems like ages doesn't have a huge effect. It's not significant, but this is also pretty highly correlated with looking and non-looking. Obviously, infants, you're going to use looking measures, right? And so you see those kind of in the same place as the looking measures. Okay, so overall today we had 2 goals. Both how do the methods compare online and in person, and how do online and in-person results compare to one another. And for the methods in general, I think they're pretty similar, right? Overall, like it may seem intimidating, but in general, the actual methodology and the stimuli that you use are pretty similar online and in person. But there are some additional constraints that you have to take into account with online, and the way that you address those constraints can make a huge difference on the outcome study and the quality of the data. And as we continue to run more online studies, the diversity of methodologies will continue to evolve. And I hope folks think that's some pretty interesting ways of measuring kids' rich behaviors online. In terms of results, based on the currently published replications that we have managed to find, the results of online studies in general appear to be pretty comparable to in-person ones. We did not find a significant difference in effect size. But again, take this with a grain of salt. This is still a pretty low sample size and is probably not high-powered enough for us to find effects of some of these moderators, although they are maybe suggestive. But also, studies involving any kind of new stimuli, new measures, new populations should be careful. Don't just take this to mean that all online studies replicate and are just comparable to in person. Everyone should do their due diligence when testing out a new method, just like they would for in-person studies. And in general, as I started off with, I think that bringing developmental research online, it's been kind of tough in some ways, but it's also kind of brought us together as a field. And I think that's been a lot of fun. And I think this both has the potential to facilitate some of these large-scale collaborations that are ongoing. You might imagine how many babies could utilize online data collection or does utilize it, but also might bring people together for collaborations that don't even exist yet. And I think that's pretty exciting. And also, online studies do have the potential to improve outreach and representation in developmental science. We might be able to run participant populations who we were not able to run before. Now, whether we actually achieve those ambitious goals is really up to us, and I really hope we do and spend some time thinking about it. So that's all I have. I want to thank all of the authors of the papers in our meta-analysis, as well as all my collaborators. So thanks so much. Sure.
So I was one of those researchers that got stuck in COVID, and so I had 1/4 of my data in person and 3/4 of my data, but I did not do online because my data required objects, very specific objects that they were used. We couldn't send 12 objects to 60 parents and all that. So what we did was a hybrid version of that, where we had the parent and the mom come in a sanitized place, and then I was on Zoom in another room as a concerned researcher. Did you find research that looked at that kind of hybridized thing? Like I studied parent-child interaction 2 to 4. So did you find any studies that looked at like that kind of interaction, that kind of social communication going on, that would have brought them to a location and then would have done the online? Yeah, I just made it up.
Yeah, I think that's been definitely the minority of cases, at least that we've reviewed. You can imagine it's still pretty fundamentally similar to a moderated method, right? Yeah. Like whether someone is in another, whether one room separates someone or, a whole country separates someone, fundamentally the interaction is pretty similar, right? Because you're viewing them over
a computer. And that was the interesting thing was almost always the kids would spend like 3 minutes like assessing about the computers. We actually had to add extra time at the beginning. So I guess one of my questions would be like, how much does technology itself moderate the behaviors, especially when you're talking about, trying to have an observational study?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's a big question of this meta-analysis and what could be a potential moderator, right? Obviously most of the participants who are running all these studies are people who have access to computers. Like there's going to be a very big difference, running a kid who has lots of experience with computers versus a kid who's never seen it before. It could be quite novel. I do think that one of the interesting things and one of the reasons that some of those studies may have actually fared better online is I think kids actually enjoy the interaction quite a bit, or can. Like the studies can be quite entertaining and engaging online. Of course, this can be distracting in some cases, but it can also mean that they're perhaps engaged for more time than they might even be in person. It's a pretty novel interaction, at least at the beginning of the pandemic was a novel interaction for kids, and this of course changes as they get more familiar. But yeah, I think that's something that we'll continue to think about and to look at, and it's no question.
Okay, great. I think we'll thank Aaron. Aaron,